So good afternoon everyone, my name is Tudor. I'm Director of Technology at Filtronic, and today I'm going to be talking a bit about high data rates for non-terrestrial networks. So looking at things like LEO satellites and how we get data from the satellite back to ground. So that's some of the presentation, then it's a very quick introduction of the I'm sure most of you know Filtronic. There's many familiar faces here, I think. I know most of you from the past anyway. I actually moved to Filtronic only 6 months ago, so I'm probably not the expert. And Jerry sat over there, he's going to understand later on, so he got lots of good questions to give that Jerry got them. So looking a bit about high data rates and what kind of requirements there are for future networks. We're seeing a lot of networks coming out with big constellations, promising lots of data transferred back to Earth, or how we need to deal with that. Some big budgets to look at what we might need in terms of power as we go up in frequency. So I'm going to be focusing on things like Q-band and E-band for these links. Obviously, typically they're very short links on the ground. So what sort of power levels do we need to get them to work for satellite? And then look at some of the power amplifiers that are available to serve that need. So have we got things on the market and what do we need to do to try and get those power levels as we push up in frequency? So a little bit about Filtronic. So core markets are on here. So critical comms is one of the markets we serve, and that's mainly in the States. So for sort of tetra networks, some diplexers and filters for that sort of application, power top amplifiers as well. Aerospace and defence has become a bigger part of our business in the last few years, and still growing with increased defence spend. And here we do anything from design through to manufacture as well. So we have a big manufacturing site in North England where we can manufacture TRMs and packaging and circuit boards. Space is a fairly new market, but we've seen a lot more interaction probably in the last 3 or 4 years as we see these new constellations coming up and a changing requirements in space. So they're not going anymore to the traditional space companies, they're looking for others to play in that market, and that's all cost driven as we start to move to thousands of satellites. They can't stay at the same price point as the geo satellites that take 10 years to develop. They need to find new players in that market, and they come to people like us to do point-to-point links on the ground and saying, can we use them and qualify with space? So that's the reason the market exists for us. We played in telecoms for a long time, doing microwave backhaul, and worked throughout the frequency range from microwave, and currently we have an E-band offering, which is our main product line. So E-band point-to-point links, 71 to 86 gigahertz links, and future development for that will be a WD-band. That comms market is quite a tough one. It's a commodity market, so we have to play at the very bleeding edge of that when we do development work. So we can serve that market for a number of years before it becomes commoditized. So we have to keep on moving in that market. So we're looking at W-band, D-band for future developments of that. So getting to very high frequencies is quite challenging actually when you get up to D-band in particular. The packaging and interconnects and stuff like that become quite challenging. And then test and measurements is a spin-off really from the other stuff. And we're serving, again, anything up to 175 gigahertz at the D-band for that market. So I guess a bit about why we need more data. Everyone knows, and that graph on the left, I think it's from Ericsson, just showing the increasing amount of data usage on terrestrial networks. And it's just huge, really. It's been getting bigger and bigger over the last few years. And obviously, part of that network in the future is going to be satellite-based. I think that's fundamental. We're seeing constellations come out. People like SpaceX with thousands of satellites already in the air, and plans for tens of thousands more. There's going to be a market for data in the air. So again, the data that's required for getting data back from the satellite to ground are going to increase as we go forward. So at the moment they're all based on Ka-band, so fairly narrow channel bandwidths, but they are looking now at Q-band and E-band for links back to ground. So I'm just doing a bit of work today looking at what that means and what can we do. So as we move from Q-band, we're talking probably 500 megahertz channels to up to 3.2 gigabit per second. Theoretical, probably a little lower than that in reality. As we get to E-band, we're talking about 2 gigahertz channels bandwidths, and we'll get to around 10 gigabit per second links in the air. So some maths, which is not my strong point. You'll all be familiar with the equation. Looking at the losses, and it's a Thurles transversal equation. So we've got things in there like the antenna gain on one side, then free space loss in there, and then we have to add in things like wind attenuation, and importantly atmospheric attenuation as well. And then we get the gain of the antenna back on the ground as well, which will boost the signal back up again to give us an overall link budget. And my only reason today for doing this is to have a look at each one of those in turn, look at Q-band and look at E-band, and try and compare the sort of power levels you'd need at each frequency for transmission from a satellite back to ground. So starting with free space loss, this one is split up with frequency obviously. I've got three different lines there, one for a HAPS link, which is on a receiver satellite type link, so these balloons flying at 20 kilometers. And then a VLEO, which is quite a low Earth orbit LEO satellite, and then the high Earth orbit LEO satellite. And it gives you some idea of the losses involved. So quite a lot of loss at these frequencies. 190 gigahertz, but 190 dB you finally get to the LEO satellite. I'm just trying to compare on the bottom there the Q-band, so that 37.5 gigahertz, that sort of level. So the loss there is 180 for the VLEO. And if we move up to E-band, we get about 4 dB more loss. So it's not a huge difference in loss, enough to be a chunk of dBs when we add them all together and see as we go forward. So I'm sure everyone in the room has seen this atmospheric absorption plot before. So peaks for oxygen and peaks for water across the frequency range. That makes some of that frequency spectrum unusable. So if you look at 60 gigahertz for longer lengths, it's virtually impossible. It's just an attenuator as we go up proper distance. But they drop back down again as we get to E-band, which is why we've got E-band links on the ground. The two significant peaks, 22 gigahertz and then 63. As I said, that's a 60 gigahertz band, which is the oxygen absorption band. The other thing to point out, I guess, for satellite is the attenuation changes with elevation angle as well, because obviously we're going through more of the lower atmosphere, depending on how we point the satellite. So it has to be taken into account with maths as well, as we do maths later on. So I've done a bit of calculation there for 60 degrees elevation. For a VLEO orbit at 600 kilometers, the loss would be 0.35 dB and 2.3 dB, sorry, for 71. So again, about 2 dB more loss as we go to E-band from Q-band. The rain's a big one. So rain doesn't do macro signals any good at all. It causes big problems, and you can see the kind of loss rates as you look at availability over on the left-hand side of the slide there. So we use statistical data for rain, and we use this on the ground for point-to-point links too. So we look at where it's located, we look at past rainfall, and the percentage availability at a particular rainfall rate, and we can use that to do calculations. One thing to point out, I guess, is the point-to-point guys on the ground want the link there all the time. So they're looking for at least 99.99% availability. So they want that link to be valid constantly. As we go to satellite, that's going to be relaxed a little bit. And if we look at things like mesh networks on satellites, where we've got satellite links, we can see that number fall quite considerably. So you could be looking for something 95% availability rather than this 99.99% availability, which makes a massive difference on the calculations when you start to look at the path loss. I've tried to show that on the table. So if you look at 99.9% availability at 71 gigahertz, you have to assume 60 dBs of loss in your calculation. If you drop that back to 95%, it drops down to 2.32 dBs, so it makes a massive difference. And probably to be sustainable, we'll need these satellite links where you can avoid the rain area as well. So you can pass data from one satellite to another and then down to Earth where it's more clear, and you don't have these massive rainfall areas. Then we've got the antenna again. This one's a good one because you get more at higher frequency for the same size satellite. So if you've got the same size dish at E-band, you actually get better performance than you would at Q-band. So you get a bit of a boost in power this time. So that's the graph on the left-hand side with the formula. So related to diameter and frequency. As we move up from the Q-band, we get a better gain of the antenna. We've got 5.5 dBs improvement in gain for 60 centimetres or 30 centimetre dish on a satellite. So we recover some of the loss we had earlier on. So some of the loss we got from the other areas like the absorption, we recover with the satellite. which is obviously critical on satellite. You know, we can't just make bigger and bigger dishes because the payload won't take it. You know, we can't just do that. On the ground, we have that option to make the dishes bigger and recover again, but in the air, that's much more difficult to do. So adding all those things together in this plot, I'm trying to show a fairly complicated graph, I guess, on this one. I've got in the brown line is a full LEO satellite with no rain. And you see at the bottom end of the frequency range here, you've got 35 dB of power, linear power, that is from the satellite, to get the signals back around in low budget. As we go into this region here, you see it shooting up as we get this oxygen absorption part, where it becomes very difficult, and there's a block in the middle where it's not possible anymore. And then as we get towards the E-band frequency ranges, you see that drop down to about 41 dBm again. So significantly more, 5 dB more power at the E-band, but not undoable, I don't think, depending on the power play you've got. And we'll cover that a bit later on, what's the technologies there. If we look at the VLEO, this drops a bit, we're down now 600 kilometers above the ground. And actually we'll see that some of the satellite constellations will be much lower than that too. So the recent SpaceX trials are looking at sort of 350 kilometer type satellites, and most of their constellation, they would probably imply E-band would be much lower than 600. But the power levels then start to drop off to something a bit more realistic, 25.9 dB at Q-band, and just over a watt, or just under 2 watts at E-band, which is probably quite achievable. If we add the rain in, and this is just picking a case of 32 millimeters per hour, which is fairly heavy rainfall, and then 99.5% availability, we start to see those numbers shoot up. So for LEO, we need 54 dBm at E-band, which is obviously not possible. For the VLEO case, that's more like 45 dBm. So probably in the realms of possibility, but we'd have to do something, I think, with that to make them achievable at E-band. That Q-band, it's probably doable now, actually. So looking at the VLEO stuff with the rain, it's the green line here. So a couple of watts at Q-band, which is probably achievable in linear at the moment, what we've got off the shelf. So I probably said this already, haven't I? So Q-band, there's the numbers anyway. I think it's achievable at Q-band. I'll show you the technology that's available in terms of semiconductors next on the next slide. But probably sort of realistic numbers where we could see PAs achievable for satellite. At E-band, probably a little bit high for LEO, full LEO constellations. VLEO, much more sensible. I've just got some extra numbers in here. So I talked earlier on about the satellite links reducing the availability. If we drop down to 95% availability, that reduces the power from 44.9 dBm to 36.79 dBm. So again, we're back in the realistic sort of space now where we can see, you know, a number of watts at E-band is probably quite possible. If we even lower the orbit and drop it down a level, down to where SpaceX are filing at the moment, we can reduce it by another 4 dBs. So we're talking, again, under 2 watts linear at E-band, which is actually pretty achievable. Look at what we've got technology-wise. Just a quick bit on satellite links. Obviously, we don't have as much atmospheric erosion because we're in free space up in the satellite level. So we can actually do very good links at RF. It's quite a good technology for satellite links. I know a lot of people are looking at optical links. I personally think they're probably a lot more expensive than RF links, and RF could do the job actually very well. And here you see at E-band we actually drop the transmission requirements because of the size of the antenna stations here. And we're talking for a 200 kilometer link, just around 20 dBm for amplifier requirement on a satellite. And for a 600 kilometer link, it's just over a watt. So you know, we're talking reasonable power levels actually for satellite links at E-band, and that's pretty achievable with technology that's off the shelf. A bit about technologies out there on the market. So there are limited limits at Q-band. There aren't that many people playing in that space because the market hasn't been there very long. But there are some players, and one of the big ones is OMIC. So they have a funded program, and they've created a 10-watt gallium nitride MMIC operating at the Q-band, offering quite flat. So 10-watt power levels across the frequency range on the bottom there, up to about 44 gigahertz. So that's pretty viable. Look at the power levels we needed from the other graph. Combining either one or two of those MMICs in a device to do power propagation at Q-band is quite reasonable to achieve. If we go to E-band, then we don't have the luxury of gallium nitride anymore, unfortunately. I think there are a couple of boutique fabs that will give you gallium nitride parts at E-band on a 0.1 micron node, but they're very limited and they're very expensive, thousands of dollars per mimic. I think they're probably impractical to use on any commercial basis. And you don't get the power that you do at lower frequency. Unfortunately, Chris is talking about lower frequency, you don't quite get at E-band. So you're probably still only talking 1 or 2 watts power output per mimic at E-band. So that leads us to combining architectures. We'll have to combine devices together to get to 5 or 10 watts that we needed earlier on. We have some in-house technology based on waveguide combiners or magic keys, very low loss techniques to combining multiple mimics. And we've exploited that for point-to-point links on the ground as well recently, and we can expand upon that for space applications. So there's the existing product, which is an 8-way combined amplifier. That has 8 mimics on the side of that structure, and they're waveguide combined inside to give you 35 to 60 dBm at E-band. So already getting the power levels that are realistic. The mock-up on the very far left-hand side is looking at combining 32 mimics. That's when taking a height and scaling it back by integers up to 32 mimics. And that would get us to above 10 watts power at E-band. It's quite a nice shape, it's still quite compact. It would sit nicely behind the dish and would allow you to integrate a transceiver. So that design there actually has an integrated LNA on that port, on the waveguide port in the middle here. The LNA sits right behind the antenna, gives you really good low noise performance. And then you have the transceiver sat underneath on the board behind the PA. It's quite a nice design for feature space. I'm nearly done, so I'm nearly done boring everyone now. Just to say, we do some custom design work as well, so we do custom design for various applications. This is one we did for a HAPS application. So this was a pseudo satellite, and this one has four 2 GHz channels, so very high data rates, the 40 gigabit per second link, and this at the time was a record breaking link for ground to air, so we've got 40 gigabit per second link using a dual E-band channel and then cross polarization, so the vertical and horizontal polarization as well. And that has an integrated multiplexer in that as well. I'm going to whiz over this one. This is our space roadmap, but we're looking at doing various things basically in Q and D-band, some demonstrator work that we're building out for LNAs, power amplifiers, and also looking at D-band for the higher power, so looking at combining structures of D-band that will get us to 2 watts, 5 watts, and 10 watts of power at E-band. We're also looking at things like linearization, looking at how we linearize amplifiers and use pre-distortion, probably analog pre-distortion, to try and get better efficiencies. That's the other problem, obviously at E-band, the efficiency is pretty poor. That leads to high power requirement on the satellite, but also thermal problems that we talked about earlier on as well. Getting heat out of these things isn't easy, particularly in space. So looking at what we can do there as well in terms of efficiency. And I've wrapped up now. So consider link budgets briefly, and done the maths behind that, looking at the Q-band and E-band, looking at what sort of power levels we'd need for power amplifiers and outlining some of the technologies available. E-band, as I said, these combining, low loss combining, but we have architectures that can do that. And it's realistic to take gallium arsenide devices and combine lots of them to actually give you the power levels you need, I think, within the footprint that you need. I think E-band will be needed for 10 gigabit per second plus. So if we need very high data rates, which we will for feeder links, getting data back all off the satellite, then we'll need to go to E-band eventually. And the mesh networks I mentioned earlier on are really important. If you want to try and avoid the hard to reach areas with rain, you need to be able to do satellite links, link satellites, have a mesh network and get back to ground with favourable conditions. Thank you.